thank you for the opportunity to speak here. One of the relative joys of getting older, and there are a few, is that on occasion people allow you to do things such as this, which is not to make a presentation in this case based on very systematic and particular research, though behind this does lie work that I've done over a number of years in some of these areas, but the opportunity just to, in a sense, share some thoughts and perspectives that might actually help to frame some of the discussion. So what I'm looking to do is under three particular headings. First of all, in this rethinking dialogue in an age of new challenges and opportunities, first of all, to think a bit and ask some questions about what I'm calling disruptions of global and personal life constructions. So disruption of global and personal life constructions. And then under a second heading, from people power to populisms, similarities and differences. So picking up there more in particular on the sub-theme of this specific panel. And then rounding off with something under the heading of populism, COVID-19 climate change, and apocalyptic religion. So that's where we're going. So to start with, disruptions of global and personal life constructions. Soon after September 11, 2001, I had a job interview at an unnamed place, and I was asked the question, what's going to be different after 9/11? Well, clearly my answer at the time didn't convince them because I didn't get the job. And in a way, my answer was I was skeptical about the premise that I think lay behind the question, which was said a lot at the time, which was things will never be the same again. This has been a world-changing, epoch-changing event. Now, part of my skepticism may be rooted partly in my own faith tradition, because in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, so-called, says, what has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? Well, one can understand that sentiment. But actually, things do seem to come along with a regularity, often in decades, that make an impact on our construction of our world, both socially, globally, and sometimes also touching us very, very personally. So a decade on from that, of course, was the global financial crash, when many of us realized how much of our world, our life world, and the system on which it's built actually is built on a kind of set of beliefs. The posh word for that is called confidence of the markets, beliefs in money, beliefs in investment, beliefs in what it will produce, belief on the basis of interest and the accumulation of interest and the further accumulation of interest, almost to the extent that one can really understand why it is that classically Islam has a critique of usury that can allow a global system of finance to be built in such a way that it's actually literally built on a set of illusions that when you pull the bricks away, come crashing down in the way that happened in the global financial crash. So disruptions of global, and in that context also many people's personal life construction, starting with the poorest in the USA and the subprime loans on their properties and what they ended up with living on the streets as a consequence of that system collapsing. And now here we are in a global pandemic, and 10 years on. And there was a very interesting article published on the 17th of June 2020, which I'll put a link to in the chat afterwards, in the New Statesman by John Gray, entitled "How Pandemics Extinguished the Roman Empire. what the fall of Rome teaches us about the twin threats of lethal disease and ecological disaster. And he wrote this: "It was only to be expected that views of the world would mutate with the arrival of the pandemic. Given the abrupt and drastic alteration in everyday experience it's brought, things could scarcely be otherwise. But the result has not been any greater realism in thinking. Undermining an established narrative of human advance, the pandemic has revealed and catalyzed deep conflicts. Geopolitical rivalries are intensifying, and xenophobia is being weaponized. In what used to be called the liberal West, intellectual tribalism and volatile ideologies thrive while conspiracy theories abound, along with fake news and quack cures. Political conflicts and cultural wars are being fought out with passionate intensity, while the virus, a lethal reminder of the brute reality of the unruly material world, spreads regardless of human beliefs." Well, it spreads in an environment where socially and politically we have seen the rise also, and it intersects with that. And in many ways, some of the reactions to the virus and the measures taken by national and other governments in relation to it connect to the rise of what is often called, certainly in the popular media, but also the subject of a great deal of academic discussion, populism. What is this populism? Of course, there's an easy way of describing it in relation to the kind of phenomena associated with Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary, God, Mother, God, Honor, and Motherland being contained in the new passports, or what's going on in Poland, or has gone on in the United States of America or Brazil, as we've touched on, or indeed the transmutation of a long-standing populist rule of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Justice and Development Party in Turkey into an increasingly authoritarian form of rule in which many thousands of ordinary religious believers, civil servants, journalists have been condemned to a kind of social cleansing, which might be described as an ongoing coup against civil society. But just hang on a minute, some will say. What's the difference between such phenomena that today are called populism and what 30 years or so ago was called people power? The overthrow of dictatorship in the Philippines, the enactment of the so-called Velvet Revolution in the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, the popular movements that led to the scaling and the breaching of the Berlin Wall. The cynic, and also some of those who support at least some of the phenomena that go under the name of populism, they say, well, maybe the difference is only that people who don't like particular political directions call populism, and that populism is a protest against the tired old global, regional, and national orders. What distinguishes it from those other waves of what were called popular people power? Well, there are some elements, I think. There is the attack on experts, and along with the attack on experts, the reduction of complexity to slogans. Have you noticed how often slogans in the present political world use 3 words only? Our classical slogan in the context of Brexit in the UK, take back control, very powerful. Perhaps the one across the pond in the USA was breaking the rule a little bit by going to 4 words, make America great again. But very often they're 3 words. And the reduction of life complexity to 3-worded slogans is, I would argue, a very key feature of what we're calling populism today. Also, the assertion of a unitary people. In the days of really existing socialism, Marxist-Leninist philosophers and politicians would often make confident assertions about the will of the people, which all too often turned out to be more of an assertion about the interests of the governing party. in relation to which one's reminded of Bertolt Brecht's quip following the uprising in the former German Democratic Republic in 1953, that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case, the government to dissolve the people and elect another? In the context of Brexit in the UK, those pushing through Brexit, that they were enacting, they claimed, the will of the people in a vote that was 51.89% to 48.11%. So do those who voted the other way no longer belong to the people, let alone the over 3 million EU citizens living in the UK who were not even allowed to vote? And this brings to light the whole question of how can democratic systems deal with the tension between majoritarian trends in democracy and the very real challenges also, and I would argue opportunities and importance of pluralism. This brings me to the third heading, populism, COVID-19, climate change, and religion. Because with the rise of the COVID pandemic, we have seen, certainly, indications of what is now become called COVID nationalism, allied with an increasing anti-scientific strand in popular thinking, and an anti-scientific strand that is sometimes also infused with religious perspectives. And religion is highly ambiguous in historical and social reality. It can bring about great achievements, wonderful things that people offer to themselves, to the world in which they live, but it can also, when it is bad religion, be incredibly dangerous. The article I started off referring to by John Gray about the fate of Rome actually refers to a book published in 2019 by Kyle Harper of Princeton University Press, The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. And Gray writes this in relation to that book. A key theme in Harper's story is that the collapse of Roman civilization could not have been avoided by greater sagacity. When they built their grand edifice, the Romans could not have known they were also creating an environment in which diseases could spread as never before, and they had no understanding of the climate changes that were underway. Still less could they have known that a conjunction of the two would lead to a destruction of their world. It is hardly surprising that by the time of Gregory, the Roman mind was unhinged by eschatological fears and apocalyptic religions. And indeed, one of the things that I think is often going on in the subterranean of popular movements and is often not properly recognized for its strength and power among many people when looked at by intellectuals is precisely this strand of religious thinking in different religious traditions. I can illustrate it from my own Christian tradition. So one will find around and about at the moment books such as The Corona Crisis, Plagues, Pandemics, and the Coming Apocalypse. One can find resale in new versions of the classic, one of the best sellers in the world, actually, in terms of paperback books, that was around when I was a teenager, and at that time interpreted the coming clash and binary division in the world in terms of the conflict between godless Soviet atheism and God-filled American liberalism, Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. And one has to understand how powerful these visions of the world can be in a context of disruption to what has been norms, in a context of disruption that is both global and profoundly personal at one and the same time. And arguably just as in the time when the Roman Empire also faced these crises of pandemic and of environmental challenge, in our environment, also fueled by and fueling on populism, these visions of the world, even if they're not held completely by large numbers of people, but there are quite large numbers of people who hold these visions, they seep into and have their influence upon popular culture. And very challenging in all of that. And it could be illustrated in relation to Islam as equally in relation to Christianity and probably other religious traditions too. And within all of that is the challenge for those who live within those traditions, not to ignore things like this, but how to engage with them from within the particular religious tradition, and how, in that sense, to try to build a world in which dialogue opens a way forward rather than closes down and dividing people into completely separate spheres, as so much apocalyptic and eschatological thinking does, and can be found, as I say, in different parts of the world, and is dangerous for the future of humankind, I think. Thank you.